Okay, so the purpose of this is to make recommendations for equipment, including a computer and DAW or Digital Audio Workstation for recording up to 4 instruments into the computer and being able to edit that to make songs. So what I'll do is I'll start off with the recommendations that I've made according to the budget. Then I'll go through some background theory that's important to know to do this. Then I'll do a very quick live demonstration to help get started. And then finally I'll introduce some of the additional features that you can use within this system that we don't really have time to go through now, but it's definitely worth knowing about for the future. So the brief was that you would have up to 4 instruments and you want to get them into a computer and also be able to listen back and monitor what you're doing. So I'll talk about the audio interface in a bit more detail, but that's the device that will take your microphones or your instruments, whatever they are, convert them into a format that the computer can understand and then pass them into your computer. I'll also talk a bit about the DAW that I recommend, which is Logic Pro. That's one I'm most familiar with and it's extremely powerful. It's not the cheapest, it's not the most expensive, it's kind of mid-range, but you can do an awful lot with it. And also, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but you would want some decent quality speakers and headphones to make sure you're getting the most out of the music that you're producing. So it's very generous budget, £3,000. You could do this a lot cheaper. For example, if you have an older Mac or a Windows machine that you already have, you could use free software like Audacity. But what I've done is put together a budget that makes sense within that £3,000 to sort of maximise what you can get for that money. So the first thing is MacBook Pro 15-inch. You need to make sure you've got something quite modern and fast, otherwise you're going to find you run out of memory quite a lot when you're trying to do rendering of audio. Audio interface, Focusrite Scarlett 18i8, that meets the requirement. It has 4 mic inputs but also 4 additional inputs, which you could potentially record a microphone through, but you could definitely record things like keyboard or other instruments through those. As I mentioned, Digital Audio Workstation Logic Pro 10, which I will talk about a bit more later. For headphones, I've recommended Beyerdynamic DT770 Pro. You could use any half-decent pair of headphones. I particularly like those because they're very comfortable, so if you're mixing for a long time, it stops your ears from getting too sore from being squashed, particularly if you wear glasses. That can be really uncomfortable. KLK Rocket RP8, I haven't used them myself, but I did a bit of research and they're very widely thought of in terms of small studio monitors. And you will need a bit of budget left aside for things like DI boxes, cabling, any other peripherals that you might need. Okay, some theory. It's important to know basically any sound that we make in the real world is an analogue phenomenon. So when we speak or play an instrument, we're actually causing a vibration to spread out, kind of like blowing up a balloon, and to travel away from the source of the sound. And the way that travels is by compressing and stretching the air as it moves. And the way we represent that is by graphing it as amplitude over time. And if we look at a graph like this, we have a 0 line. So whenever we're above the 0 line, we're representing squashing the air, and whenever we're below the 0 line, we're representing stretching the air. So this is a graphical representation of a sound vibrating and travelling through the air. And although this might look overly simplistic, it's just a single wave, it is a fair representation of reality because any sound can be broken down into a sum of different sine waves at different frequencies. If we go into Logic for a second, you can hear what that sounds like. And this is a test tone at 1 kHz. And what that means is we have one complete vibration, one squash and stretch of the air every millisecond. So in 1 second we have 1,000, which means it's 1,000 times per second vibration, which gives us 1 kHz sound wave. And if we look at a graph of just the frequency content of that, we have spike at 1 kHz and no other sound because this is as simple as you can get. This is a single tone. Now, that's how we perceive the world, but a computer doesn't understand a continuous signal like that. What a computer has is a bunch of numerical samples that represent an amplitude and a time. So in order to convert from the analog world that we live in into the digital world that computers live in, we have to sample. And sampling theory, Shannon-Nyquist theorem states that in order to represent a waveform, we need to sample it twice for every complete cycle. And that's shown on this graph as the green dots. So if you can imagine joining these dots up as sampling, within a millisecond we're sampling twice, and that gives us enough information to join up the dots for our 1 kilohertz wave. So to sample at 1 kilohertz, our sampling theorem needs to be 2 kilohertz, otherwise we wouldn't capture enough information to accurately represent this wave. If we don't sample frequently enough, that sound still exists, it's still recorded, but it's not accurately represented. What happens is it folds back or it's aliased. And I have a representation of this from within Logic Pro, where what we have is a 1 kilohertz pulse. And as we start to sample more coarsely, we start to see other frequencies appearing. And what that'll do is it'll add coloration or artifacts into the sound. And when we get to a very coarse sampling period, those artifacts actually start to interfere with the primary pulse. So by then we'll have lost any sense of what that sound actually sounds like. It will just be full of other frequencies that are not what we actually want. And similar to recording sampling interval, we also have bit depth, which is how many times we slice up the waveform in the amplitude direction. So, for example, 8-bit, like you might hear in a computer game, we would sample the amplitude 256 times. 16-bit, which is more common for modern audio, is 65,000 times. And if we go up to 24-bit, it's actually more than 16 million samples for each amplitude representation that we're recording. That's an awful lot, and what that will do is give us a very large file. Now that is actually broadcast standard, but that's more information than you'd have in a CD, so it might be overkill for what we're trying to do. And what this diagram shows is our 1 kilohertz waveform again, but this time we've downsampled it from 24-bit to 4-bit, and you can see we get that stepping appearance. Okay, the other bit of theory you might need to know is bitrate. What we're working with within Logic is lossless formats, so we have an accurate representation of the analog waveform, and they're very big. So if you want to share songs or you want to play them back on an MP3 player, for example, what we tend to do is compress them. And MP3 is an example of a compressed format. Now they are lossy, which means the more you compress them, the less of the original information you'll retain. And the bitrate is a representation of how accurately we are sampling the input information. So for example, we can sample at 128 kilobits per second, and that means each second of data contains 128 kilobits. And that would be relatively low resolution. 160 kilobits, 192 kilobits are both quite high resolution. Logic can go up to 320, which I do tend to deliver in, and that should sound almost indistinguishable from the lossless file, but again it might be overkill. So what do you need to know? Well, we talked about sampling rate in terms of the 1 kilohertz tone, but because the human ear can hear from around 20 hertz up to around 20 kilohertz, we need to sample beyond 20 kilohertz, which means we need sampling rate beyond 40 kilohertz. So CD quality is 44.1 kilohertz and 16-bit. Professional broadcast audio tends to be 48 kilohertz and 24-bit. And just bear in mind that if you oversample, you're going to potentially make your computer run more slowly, and also you're going to take up more file space. So the audio interface that I recommend is a Scarlett, Focusrite Scarlett 18i8. What that means is you have 4 main inputs, and they are able to provide phantom power for microphones, which I'll talk about later. And you also have 4 additional line level inputs, so that would work off an instrument, or if you're amplifying something before it gets to the box. And I actually have an example of a very similar unit here. This has just got 2 inputs, but I'll use this for a live demonstration because essentially it's the same thing, it's just a smaller version. So the Digital Audio Workstation, this is an example of what Logic Pro looks like. You can see it looks very much like a mixing desk, so the lower window in this representation has faders and pots like you'd see on a traditional mixing desk. So it's very visual, very intuitive. top window we have our waveforms or MIDI, whatever, and then we have more information in the inspector window on the left. So it's very powerful, very visual representation of what we're doing. So we're now looking at Logic Pro 10. I have an instrument. I'm not going to play a tune, don't worry. And in order to put this through the Focusrite interface, in theory you could stick your guitar lead into the XLR socket, because although these look like microphone XLR sockets, they're actually multiple use sockets. So you can stick a guitar cable straight in there, but if you do that you'll find it's very noisy and probably quite quiet, because the level that comes out of the guitar is not really appropriate for the computer. So what we have, this one way of doing it is to use what's called a DI, or direct injection box, and what this will do is make the signal an appropriate level, an appropriate impedance, and because it gives a balanced output, that cancels some of the noise in the signal path, so it's much quieter. Unfortunately this bass is a bit faulty, so this isn't going to sound amazing, but what I'm going to do is I actually have the bass plugged through a DI box and into channel 1 on the Focusrite. So what I've done is I've gone to my channel 1, I've told it here to get pickup input 1, and it knows that that means this left channel on this box. And you can see at the moment we have red here, and red is bad. Red means this is too loud, and unlike the analog domain, digital signals that are too loud tend to sound unpleasant. So what I need to do is what's called gain staging, which is turn the gain pot on the front of the interface until my sort of loudest level that's going into the computer isn't peaking. So it's not going red, it's not going to distort. And actually the Focusrite has a nice feature that if you turn it up too loud, the volume pot itself goes red, which is really handy because it tells you right away that your level is too loud. Okay, so once we're happy with the gain, if I hit R for record, you can do this with a click track. I don't need it right now, but if I just make some notes, you see some waveforms appearing on the screen. And hit spacebar to stop. If I now record again, what's really clever is it will start from the beginning again. So it looks like I've destroyed what was already there, but what it actually does is non-destructive recording, so it still has my first take, it just puts my second take in front of it. So that way you can be a bit cautious, you can build up different takes. If you don't like it, delete it, get rid of it, but if you're experimenting and you want to be overly cautious, you can save each take individually, which is really cool. That's a nice feature. If I then want to record another track, I can just create another track, input 1 again, make sure that that's not going to record, hit the R, so this is it's called record enabling the track, so now it knows to direct this sound onto that track. And if I hit R again, get a count in. And what you notice this time is it played back the original noise that I made and let me play over the top of that. So if you're building up a song in parts, if you're composing by yourself, that's really useful. Of course, you could mute that original track and then just create something completely different, but if you're working by yourself, that's a really powerful thing to be able to do. The other option for getting your instrument in is to go through an amplifier using a microphone. If you have dynamic microphone that looks like this, that's fine, that will just work. If you have a condenser like this will need what's called phantom power. So the first thing we want to do is plug the microphone in. Okay, once we're plugged in, don't do it before you plug in, because there's a risk of sending a spike through the speaker and you could potentially damage the microphone. Once you're plugged in, hit the 48 volt button on the front of the unit and that will give this microphone power, and because that works on capacitor, it needs a bit of charge to charge up the plates. It just won't work without it. So what we should find now is we have a signal, and essentially, if I were to now go through the same process again, I record, enable, create a new track, record, enable it, hit record. After making sure my levels were set correctly, I could then record through that microphone from the amp into the computer, and you can see this way, this is how you could record a vocalist or any other instrument, or even a full band with a pair of stereo microphones if you wanted. That's mostly what I wanted to talk about, but just to give an overview of some of the other things that Logic Pro can do. One is you can actually import a video file, and while you can't edit the video in there, you can put sounds with frames, so you could have things starting and finishing as things change on the picture, so that's really powerful. It also has a couple of very good synthesizers built in. Without paying any extra money, you can get these synthesizers up and make all manner of weird sounds, so that's fantastic. And also it goes really well with the video editing because it's great for sound design for film. Many plugins, sort of fairly standard things like compressors, reverb, chorus, so you can put all those common effects on vocals or any instrument you want really. And some nice features like actually a pedal board that you can bring up, amp simulator, and this is fantastic because it shows you the amp you're using, it shows you all the settings on the head, and it even shows you how you've mic'd up the cone. And these are really powerful emulation tools if you're on a very tight budget. One feature that's extremely clever is they have a bunch of pre-recorded drummer tracks, and you can just customize them as much as you want to come up with something that's actually quite unique, and this is definitely worth investigating and figuring out what you can do with it. If you prefer electronic drums, there's Ultrabeat, which is a really good sequencer, and it has a lot of built-in sounds, but it's also very customizable and has a lot of classic drum sounds in there, like 808 for example. And finally, if you want to make music by yourself and you don't have the instrument to play, you can actually draw the notes in as MIDI and then assign an instrument to them, and all those instrument voicings are built in, and it's very good, very quick and extremely intuitive to use. So in summary, what I would recommend is a decent MacBook. It doesn't really matter which headphone and speakers, but something reasonably good so you're going to get an accurate representation of what you're doing. And I would definitely recommend Logic Pro if you have the budget for it. However, if you don't, you can do a lot of this basic stuff in something like Audacity without spending about £150. It's completely free. It looks ugly, but it works really well. And that's that. Thank you.